here in conversation with Kathleen B. Jones this evening, and thank you to Kendall for inviting me to be the interlocutor. I'm going to read Kathleen's biography, and then I have questions for her, and then we will see if you have questions for Kathleen too after our discussion. I'll read the bio from the back of her novel, Cities of Women. Kathleen B. Jones was born and educated in New York. She holds a BA in political science from Brooklyn College and a PhD from the political science program at CUNY's Graduate School and Center. After teaching women's studies for 2 decades at San Diego State University, she resigned to focus on writing, recently earning an MFA in fiction from Fairfield University. Dr. Jones's scholarly writing includes 6 books published with academic presses, 3 monographs and 3 edited anthologies of critical essays. Diving for Pearls, A Thinking Journey with Hannah Arendt won the 2015 Barbara Penny Kramer, Canner Book Award, from the Western Association of Women Historians. Her essays and short fiction have appeared in Fiction International, Mr. Beller's Neighborhood, the Briarcliff Review, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. And she now lives in Stonington, Connecticut. I am just going to go ahead and leap in. Okay. So in these, I don't know if we'll get to them all, but we'll see how it goes. So Christine de Pizan and Verity Fraser are 2 of the focal characters. There's actually a 3rd focal character named Beatrice Tapis. So Christine's and Verity's points of view are both 3rd person, but Beatrice Tapis, alias Anastasia, is 1st person. But maybe before we talk about point of view, would you mind just doing a gloss of the plot? And, yeah, just anything that you think would be useful for the audience to know.
Sure. It's a dual timeline novel, which means we follow a character in the contemporary period in about the year 2018 as she sets out on a quest to discover whether or not she can prove that the artist who illuminated the medieval manuscripts of Christine de Pizan was a woman named Anastasia. And Christine de Pizan is an historical figure who wrote in the early 15th century. She was influential in the court of Charles VI. Her father had been an astrologer in the French court of Charles V. And as a young girl, she became very, very familiar with the king's library. And her father was very, very much supportive of her education. Her mother was not. And Christine pursued education with the support of her father. And at the age of 25, she was widowed with 3 children and a mother to support. And given the laws in France at the time, she could not inherit her husband's property. So she was basically left with a lot of debt. And the second timeline follows not just the character of Christine de Pizan, but Anastasia, who has been transformed into an artist. She starts out as Beatrice Tapis in the novel and undergoes a traumatic experience, but is able to rededicate herself to her art and becomes the artist who helps Christine de Pizan in her workshop to create these gorgeous illuminated manuscripts. The inspiration for the novel comes from one line in the book of the City of Ladies, in which is an actual citation of an artist named Anastasia by Christine de Pizan. We don't know whether or not Anastasia was real or just a metaphor for all of the unrecognized artists in the medieval period who were women. But de Pizan says, I know a woman named Anastasia who is among the finest artists in Paris. No one can exceed her in the beautiful illuminations that she creates in manuscripts. And it was on the basis of that one sentence that I thought, wow, that would be fun to invent an entire story and actually demonstrate the development of this woman artist in the late 14th and early 15th century, despite the fact that everyone assumes that all of the artists were men. And so I created the modern character to become so determined, she's willing to put everything on the line and try to prove that this artist, Anastasia, actually existed. And whether or not she succeeds, you'll have to read the book to find out.
Thanks, Kathleen. So we've gotten a bit of a plot summary, and also Kathleen introduced the 3 focal characters. Each of them is narrating portions of the novel. Christine Verity, who's in 2018, I'm guessing it's because you wanted to avoid pandemic times. Is that why it's set in 2018?
Well, I was writing around that period of time.
Okay, all right. I figured you probably had taken a few years to,
Oh,
there's so
yes.
much research.
Yeah.
A lot longer than just maybe a
Yeah,
couple years.
yeah.
Yeah. So you have, like, what was the rationale for writing Beatrice, the artist, who is known as Anastasia, as a first person point of view character, but third person for the other two?
Well, I wanted to use first person point of view because I wanted to give her a strength and let her, in a way, tell her story. And I thought that first person point of view was interesting because I could invent the voice that would be sort of parallel with that time, and experimenting with a medieval voice without being overly, how can I put it, stiff in the narration was exciting to me. It allowed me to get into different perspectives about the times that she was living in through her perspective. I wanted to use third person for the other characters because that allows you to have a very different kind of perspective. The third person point of view, the character may not necessarily understand everything that's going on around her, but she may come to an understanding. And in fact, that's what happens with the Verity Fraser character. So it's a little bit more outside, but it's a close third person point of view. So I'm able to do both interior reflection and description of what's going on in the world around her, and enable her to begin to discover things she didn't know about herself.
It was really interesting because I thought, because she's the most contemporary character, present day mostly. I mean, 2018 is, it's very recent past. I would have thought that would be easier to write in first person, but I was really impressed by the fact that Beatrice is in the 1300s, is, someone who you inhabit. Her interiority is also really convincing.
The other reason why I didn't, it was actually more difficult for me to write first person in a modern perspective. I felt like, to get out of my own head, I needed to be in third person in the modern period. Whereas to get inside what it might be like for a character in the late medieval period, I wanted to write first person. It helped in both of those instances.
Yeah, I mean, it's really impressive how you balance all three of those narrative threads, and they're all obviously intimately connected. And there's also sort of a speculative aspect. I'm kind of jumping around in my questions, but I loved that. I mean, I thought that was really interesting how there are visions that de Pizan and Anastasia both have that I thought were really striking, but they were also believable. I was wondering, did you invent those wholesale, or were they in their papers if they kept diaries? I'm curious about that.
Christine de Pizan did have a kind of memoir-ish writing that she did. I could use some of those materials, but I drew on some of her other writings where she herself reports sort of having visions, but I created...
Of women, too.
Of women, yes. In fact, in the book of City of Ladies, 3 women appear to her: Lady Reason, Lady Rectitude, and Lady Justice, at the point at which she's in sort of the most despair. She's sitting in her study and she picks a book off the shelf and opens it and finds all of these horrible things that men have written about women. And she becomes so upset about it that she becomes hateful of herself, and she says, of the entire female sex. And that's when the 3 spirits or ladies arrive and basically say to her, girlfriend, why don't you trust your own judgment and your own point of view and not believe everything that's written? You're an educated woman, and actually let's take a journey. And they take her through history. And there've been many, many novels these days that are revisions of mythologies. There are revisions of ancient Greek tales. And in many ways, Christine de Pizan is one of the first to write massive revisions of the stories that have been told about women, whether from Ovid or she's also influenced by Dante, and there's a little bit of that you see in the journey that she takes. So the speculative elements are there in spirit in her own writings, and I simply took some of them and imagined more about them.
It was really interesting because at times you're thinking, is this a dream, or are they? And because Christine de Pizan goes on a very long journey at one point with one of the ladies of Reason, or I can't remember who.
Well, she meets Lady Reason as she's in the process of going through her studies. Actually, it's a point in the novel where she's going to Poissy, which is where one of the convents in France were at the time, and her daughter had decided to go to a convent, not very much in favor with her mother at the time, but nonetheless, she joined this convent, and she's going to visit her daughter in the convent, and Anastasia has created a book to give to the convent at the time. And so I kind of, that's when she has these visions of people appearing and encouraging her to continue on.
One thing too, I was curious about the fact that, the book arts were, I don't think the printing press was invented until 15.
Yeah.
What was,
15,
the Gutenberg.
That's right,
yeah.
20 something. I can't remember exact year, but this is all before the
Everything
printing
is,
press.
the scribes are writing every book by hand. There's obviously no photocopy machine. And everything is being, as the foundational part of the novel is that, as Kathleen said, Anastasia is an illuminator. So she illustrates books. And so these books are extremely valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I was really interested in, the term Book of Hours is mentioned in various places in this novel, and the fact that kings and queens granted favors to writers who presented them with the gift of original work in book form, as de Pizan did with Charles V. What would be today's equivalent if there is one? Because it's interesting. They're like, I'm going to get some favors from this king because I gave him a book. I mean, today it just seems unbelievable that would be this cherished object and in a court,
right?
Rather than jewels.
I don't know what the equivalent would be. It certainly wouldn't be books.
No, I know. It's just so interesting that you could curry favor with a powerful.
It's you could curry. You were actually in many cases you were given support by the elite to write books for them. And so it's a question of, for instance, de Pizan wrote a biography of Charles V. And it became very important at the time because she was trying to influence the direction in which the people who were responsible for Charles VI were going to go politically. Charles VI, of course, was married to Queen Isabella of Bavaria. And Christine writes a very favorable portrait of Charles V during the reign of Charles VI in order to sort of signal the direction in which she wants the political factions of France to go. And it's a debate, in a sense, between Philip of Burgundy and Louis d'Orléans about who's going to control Charles VI. He was known as the Mad King. And not only that, but when she writes one of her most famous books, the Queen's Book, which is in the British Library in London, she situates the book of the City of Ladies in the center of that book and donates it to the Queen as an indication of her support for the Queen's power. She couldn't rule as a monarch, but she still had power. So there were lots of ways in which Christine is very, very involved in shaping the politics of the time. But what would be the equivalent of trying to curry favor with factions today? I suppose you'd give them property, or you'd promise to cast all the votes in an election,
Yes.
go in one particular direction.
Oh gosh, yeah. No, you have lobbyists.
Don't get me started
now.
on
Now
that.
it's lobbyists.
Right.
Yeah, essentially. But I love that the book arts were so highly regarded and they were also used as vehicles for political influence, which is not something that I don't think I'd ever encountered that before.
The Book of Hours are often private prayer books, so and the more beautiful ones, of course, are extraordinarily expensive. And one of the great historians of the medieval manuscripts points out that while the kings were fostering all of this extraordinary art, a lot of the poverty still, existed in the regimes. So, there's a double side to the fact that these books were beautiful objects, but still not necessarily helping the development of most people's standard of living at the time. But we can't complain about the fact that unlike some of the books on the shelf, they've survived 6, 7, in some cases 1,000 years of history because they're handmade and they've been preserved. So I like to think that we'd think about preserving physical books now the same way, especially in a digital age.
Right. Which I mean, who knows how we'll find out, or maybe it won't be in our lifetimes, but just how long those books will endure. Ebooks, for example, but just by the virtue of the fact they don't exist in physical form. It's so strange in a way when you think about it. I'm so curious. I mean, we've touched on it just slightly, but regarding the amount of research that you've done, because there's so many esoteric topics and they're also highly technical. For example, the fact that parchment was from animal skin and it had to be prepared in a very specific way. And there's actually this intriguing plot point that happens in where a parchment vendor who also double-crossed Beatrice is really given his comeuppance. There's a lot of interesting
That was fun to make up.
Yeah. So I mean, there's just, can you comment on your research process? I'm guessing you had to travel to London because there's the British Library, also Paris, the Bibliothèque Nationale, and then Avignon, which they lived for a little while. I don't know if you went.
I did
down
not go there. No.
But just maybe tell us a little bit about your process.
I had done I couldn't have done the book without the digitization of manuscripts. So the point I was making before about physical books, of course, I have to offer the caveat that because they're so rare, even unless you're some renowned paleographer who wants to study the letters on the page in an ancient manuscript, you're not going to be given the opportunity in most cases to have access to most of these books. So when I went to the London Library, the British Library, to study the Queen's book, I could only look at it digitally. I couldn't see it physically. But I did go to the Morgan Library, and there are scenes in there in the New York Morgan Library. And I actually participated in a workshop that was about parchment making and making medieval ink and the materials and the implements that scribes use to create these manuscripts. And the added benefit of doing that, besides learning about that craft, that art, was that the Morgan had put out some of its most rare manuscripts for the few of us who participated in the workshop. And those I got to hold and touch. And that was an extraordinary experience. And there's a lot in the novel about the sensory, sensual quality of these physical books and about the tactile quality of knowledge coming through that sense, as opposed to just reading with our eyes, because these books are in many ways multidimensional. I mean, I'm happy that the published version, in the hardback version, has raised print on the outside of the cover, because it kind of gives you a feeling for the touch that is involved in reading, even if you are not visually challenged.
So the covers, and oh yes, there is a little tiny bit of embossment. That's really, it's a beautiful cover too. The artist, I'm curious, you must have given input, or did they just send it off to their book?
They sent it out to
artists?
The designers. They sent the manuscript out and had some ideas, but I had input into saying which of the designs they came back with that I liked, and it was unquestionably this one. To be honest with you, I was frightened out of my mind about what it would look like.
You're like, pink, please.
Pink. Yeah. They picked up the blue, the lapis lazuli, which is a very prominent color, and the gold. And the gold, the illumination, which is really gold leaf that's placed after all the paintings are done to cast light when the book appears in a kind of lighted area. So they caught all those elements, and I was grateful to the designers for that. So that was exciting.
I know. I thought they did a great job. As you said,
yeah.
You just don't know. And you've seen plenty of books covers that you're thinking like, no way.
Yeah,
would I ever want that to be my book cover? How are we on time? What time is it?
6:25.
Okay, so I have one more question, and then we'll open it up to anyone here who might have a question for Kathleen. One thing that was interesting to me, and you mentioned a little bit about this, Christine de Pizan, obviously when she was widowed, she basically just became destitute when she had been a high-ranking, member essentially of the court. So I was struck by the perilousness of the situations, and there's even a time when Beatrice and her mother are moving from was that Villeneuve? They move and they move to Paris, but it takes them weeks and weeks and weeks, of course, because it's the 1300s. And then they suffered violence and double crossing, and there's rape also. they just, it's amazing that they made this journey at all. So aside from that, the political upheaval, the plague, untimely deaths of spouses and parents, certainly times have changed, but I don't know if they've changed as much as we'd like to think. I'm curious about your perspective on this, because this is really a book about, women who have agency but in a sense, we all exist in a world that is still very much ruled by the whims of certain male leaders, and of capitalism too, captains of industry. So I'm curious what your perspective is about this, because it's a very contemporary book, but it's not set mostly, and it's set in the past.
There are a lot of parallels between the 14th century and now. The plague, the plague killed 1/3 of Europe. But we've, of course, lived through a similar kind of situation with COVID and are still. Political corruption, sound familiar? Religious corruption. It was not uncommon for priests and higher ranking religious authorities to sell indulgences in the Catholic Church, so that you would, gain your rights to heaven by, basically paying for your sins. And there's a really interesting scene in the novel about how Beatrice/Anastasia takes advantage of the local priest in this regard, and that becomes sort of her way of getting out of Villeneuve-sur-Avignon and getting her way towards Paris. So I actually wanted to draw parallels between then and now, and underneath it all, for me, and this is the author telling you what she thought the book was about, and of course you'll read it and see something entirely different. But underneath it all, I always thought it was about time, and the fact that time, we think of time as, past, present, and future. But in fact, all of the characters, and that's another reason why the speculative element comes in, the characters feel the past in the present, and imagine the future in the present. So it's much more like time exists without separation, and the past comes alive for Verity when she sees these books. She has this sort of almost mystical experience that she's passing through a tunnel when she looks at these amazing images, and she has actually sort of leapt across the ages back into the 14th or 15th century. So for me, drawing the parallels and the issues that we were dealing with, that people were dealing with then, that we're still dealing with now, but also, getting us to have a different sense of time, not so much passing as being able to be alive very, 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 very powerfully in the present.
I kept thinking about, things have not changed that much. They have, obviously, scientifically, but, as far as the advances that women have made as citizens, it's, we've made a lot more. We're not still in 1300, but there are definitely a lot of things that could be better, maybe you could say.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kathleen, for answering my questions.
Thank you.
Does anyone in the audience have questions?
I'm Jennifer. Kathleen, I was curious about when your bio was introduced, and if I think of a journey from political science 1 to political science 2 to professor of women's studies, to a platform as a novelist telling stories that help to both expose where we haven't made progress, but advance and hopefully inspire progress. Can you share with us the journey how you move from a platform of political science and what inspired that to women's studies, and what is this platform the one that you think is going to make the biggest impact?
I don't know whether it'll make
advance the narrative that obviously you've been a student and an advocate of for a long time based on your bio.
Yeah, I went into. That's okay. I went into political science when I was in college, and I am definitely a child of the 60s. I, became involved in politics because of everything that was going on the campus around me. It was unavoidable. And at the time, I was a dance major. I was very interested in, performing arts. But I knew that I wasn't going to be the next Martha Graham. And so I was also taking political science courses simultaneously because I had such a passion for politics. And so I double majored, and then I went on to get my graduate degree in that. And the political science, it likes to call itself a science, but the area that I was interested in most was political theory or philosophy, thinking about, what could the world be like? And reading people who, all the way from Aristotle onwards to think about what the world might be like. And that kind of led naturally because of my involvement in the women's movement from 1970. I was one of those people walking down Fifth Avenue, August 26, 1970, with the signs yelling and so forth and so on. It led naturally to women's studies at a time when we didn't have any women's studies courses. And so when I first started teaching political science at one of the schools that I first worked at, I introduced courses on women in politics because that was my passion. So, I mean, thematically, I see a natural line going through, but I had to unlearn writing as a scholar in order to write fiction. And it was really liberating because when you write scholarship, you're writing for 3 or 4 people who might read an essay or a book that you've written, and you have to write in a particular way in order to get published. And it's really boring. And even if you're writing about things that you love. And then I'll tell you briefly, I had one incident that really pushed me in the direction of creative writing, absolutely. And that was when I was chair of the Women's Studies Department at San Diego State University in the mid-90s. And a young woman student of mine was murdered by her boyfriend. And I decided I was going to write something about that. And because I'd been trained the way I had, I started to write about it as why did this happen? What about choice and freedom and yada, yada, yada. And then I realized, no, I want to tell the story about what happened. And as a teacher, telling stories was always the way that you got students interested anyway in a subject. And I think the great philosophers were storytellers. And so, but I had to work out of a different part of my brain, literally, to find the voice of a writer. And I remember sending that one of the drafts of that book I just described to an editor I'd worked with before, and she said to me, "Lose all the footnotes." And that was like, throw away your security blanket and find your voice. And then I felt, and when I sent her the draft of what I then wrote differently, she said to me, you really do know how to write. So then I knew I needed more training in the craft. Really what you learn to be a writer by reading and writing. But I wanted to have some structure. And so that's why I went back later in life to get my MFA. And that was absolutely fabulous because I did finish a draft of the novel during the course of that degree, although then I had to work another number of years on fine-tuning it, and actually getting it out into the world took another few years. So it's a long process, which is why it starts in 2018.
I thought, it's brilliant because you avoid the pandemic if it were set in 2021 or 2020.
Right.
So
Yeah.
But it's still very much the contemporary era.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, I was actually curious. Well, other people might have questions. Does someone else have a question for Kathleen?
How long did you work on it?
Probably 4 years, if you include the actual draft and then revising and following suggestions from the editor and all of the feedback we did or didn't get when we submitted it for publication to various publishing houses. So yeah, I'd say it took 2 years to get a good draft and then another 2 to really bring it to a more polished state.
You commented about the politics and the issues today compared to the period you were writing about. Having been in academia for many years, could you comment a little bit about academic politics?
Oh, don't get me started.
I didn't mention, I teach at Northwestern and I'm the director of their MFA program in the School of Professional Studies. So I'm very curious to hear what Kathleen has to say about this.
when I was at San Diego State University, I worked in a lot of capacities. I started out as a part-time lecturer. Then I worked with the union to help everybody get organized. And then I had an opportunity to be full-time. Then I had a tenure track position. Then I became chair of the department. Then I went into the dean's office and was an associate dean. Then I became part of the provost office and worked on a project that we had with 3 San Diego inner city schools and the university. So I looked at a whole bunch of dimensions of the university. And I would say, in a nutshell, it's really difficult to introduce substantive change into the academy. Even in women's studies, which prides itself on being a change-oriented discipline and on doing things differently. But once it became a department, we had to conform. We had to follow, the standards of what publications counted and so forth and so on. And even as we tried to, when I was in the dean's office, I tried to introduce certain changes. Like we created what we called an experimental interdisciplinary curriculum, which meant that instead of a student taking one course here, one from column A, one from column A, we created a 9-unit class. And that allowed the students to be taking, let's say, an English and a history and a theater course simultaneously. 3 professors were there, and they broke out into different groups. So the students would have some sense of like, why am I taking this English class and this history class and because we created a curriculum that used history materials, English and theater on a common topic. Getting that through the budget, it was hard to accommodate. Even some of the disciplines that I was trying to draw on to create this experiment were resistant, because you're taking seats away from them, which count towards the budget, et cetera, et cetera. So, academic politics comes down, at least in the public university, to the fact that you have to be aware of what your budget is going to enable you to do or not do. And because we've had such a decline in public money for public education, we're more and more dependent on donors in public universities to fund, and that creates all kinds of other, issues. So, there's big politics at the university and little politics, and it's a lot about politics.
Hmm.
I have a question. I can't wait to read your book.
Thank you.
It just sounds fabulous. But this is a little off the subject, but you're so brilliant and I admire you so much. And I just have to ask you this question about women's studies in a way. But with the Me Too movement and all that's going on, and then the domestic violence that still goes on, how much have you seen actually change since the 70s? And could you just speak for a second about your thoughts on all this?
I think a lot has changed and a lot has gone back to the way it was before 1970. What's changed is that there's much more public awareness of issues around the Me Too movement, around sexual violence, around domestic violence. But I think there's still a lot of backlash about articulating the seriousness of those issues. In terms of rights in this country, there has been a forward march, but given the series of Supreme Court decisions that I've seen lately, I don't know where I am anymore, to be honest with you. I never thought I would live the day to see Roe v. Wade overturned. Never. That was 50 years, that we worked for that. So, but it's like that, there's the energy. I want to see the energy in the young, let's say Gen Z, around these issues has to be and is being revitalized, I think, seriously. We don't see enough of newspaper reports about stuff that's going on at the local level. We're waiting for the next big national march, national movement, but there's so much stuff going on at the local level, people working hard on these issues, especially in the aftermath of the decision that overturned Roe. Yes, there's been a lot of progress, but at the same time, we're finding that we're having to fight some of the same battles all over again.
And interestingly, the rate of people getting abortions has not decreased.
No, it's increased. This
Right.
year it's increased.
Right. I
Mhm.
mean, that's the irony of the whole thing. It's like,
Mhm.
anyway, that's another discussion. But,
But there
it's,
is a
yeah.
scene in the novel about this, and I struggled a lot with writing that scene. What happens when, I don't want to, too many spoilers, but there's a difficult decision that Beatrice has to make. And it was really interesting for me as a writer because I had to be careful not to impose my point of view on the character. And I had to really work hard and think hard about, like, what would this woman think of doing in the, in the 1300s. And I let the character figure it out. And it was different from what I might have otherwise written based on my own, and that's another reason why the first person point of view was helpful, because, I was occupying her head, not trying to put my point of view into her head. So see what you think about that. But, I think the Me Too movement, there's a really amazing book, if I can advertise another writer's book, called Disobedient, by Elizabeth Fremantle, British writer, and it's about Artemisia Gentileschi. Some of you may have seen some of her paintings, Renaissance painter. She painted, you've seen her?
And there's a film too.
And there's a
actually.
film, well, there's a
Yeah.
film. And that is an amazing book to read, because if you read that book, it's deeply influenced by the Me Too movement. And so that's another thing that's happening. Back to the point you were making about, fiction. I think you can get things across in fiction because people read stories, they're moved by stories that you can't in, scholarly essays. And I'm not diminishing, the 30 years of my life that I spent writing them.
That's why I asked the question.
Yeah,
Like, at
I-
some point you find the platform that amplifies.
Yeah, and I just think it's I couldn't have probably done what I did without the other experience that I had. So yes, you write, what or from your experience, but I had to unlearn some of it as well. And I think you'll see a lot of novels today that are influenced by what's going on now and have women's voices at the foreground and writing about these issues and take lessons in chemistry. One of the things about that book that's really so fascinating is a lot of young people are reading it and they're saying, oh my God, that's what it was like in the 1950s and early 60s. Yeah, and it's still like that in many
Right.
ways,
Yes.
mansplaining, etc. No offense to you or you, but no. Anyhow.
I think we should use the rest of the time for book signing, since Kathleen has copies of her beautiful novel that she can sign.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm guessing we can give them. Oh, yeah. Oh, and there's also refreshments.
Oh, yes,
provided by
there are
Kendall, who
refreshments.
is,